Welcome to Sleepy Stories. In this episode, we will take a clear and steady look at how nature finds stability. The aim is simple. This story is here to help you learn something meaningful while you rest. If sleep does not come immediately, that is completely fine. You can still listen, still absorb interesting scientific ideas, and allow your body to relax at its own pace. Simply listen, let your breathing slow, and allow the information to settle gradually. If you enjoy these calm explorations, you can like and subscribe to Sleepy Stories, which helps others find their way here as well. When people think about stability, they often imagine stillness, a quiet lake, an unchanging landscape, a system at rest. In nature, stability rarely looks like that. The natural world is always in motion. Air circulates, water flows, energy moves from one place to another. Living organisms grow, repair themselves, and interact with their surroundings. Even the ground beneath your feet shifts slowly over time. Yet despite all this movement, nature does not dissolve into chaos. Forests persist, oceans remain oceans, the planet continues to support life. Stability exists, but it takes a different form than we might expect. In science, stability does not mean that nothing changes. It means that change remains within certain limits. A stable system is one that can experience variation without losing its basic structure or function. Temperatures rise and fall, but not beyond what the system can tolerate. Populations grow and shrink, but do not disappear under normal conditions. Chemical balances shift, but remain compatible with life. Stability, in this sense, is not the absence of motion. It is the ability to endure motion. To understand this, it helps to think of nature as a set of ongoing processes rather than fixed objects. A forest is not a static collection of trees. It is a flow of energy captured from sunlight, transformed by plants, transferred through animals, and recycled by microbes. Individual trees die, but the forest remains. The shape of the system persists even as its components change. This is one of the most important ideas in understanding natural stability. What lasts is not the material itself, but the pattern of relationships. At every scale, from cells to ecosystems to the planet as a whole, nature relies on continuous adjustment. Conditions shift, and systems respond. When something moves too far in one direction, other processes tend to push back. This does not happen because nature has intentions or goals. It happens because physical laws, chemical reactions, and biological responses are interconnected. Action leads to reaction, cause leads to effect. Over time, these interactions produce balance. This kind of balance is dynamic. It depends on constant activity. Consider the temperature of a living body. It remains within a narrow range, not because nothing happens, but because countless small processes are always at work. Heat is produced, heat is lost, signals are sent, and adjustments are made. The system is stable precisely because it never stops responding. The same principle applies far beyond biology. The atmosphere circulates to distribute heat. Oceans absorb and release energy. Ecosystems adjust as conditions change. Motion is not the enemy of stability, it is the foundation of it. Understanding stability in this way changes how we see change itself. Change is no longer a threat to order. It is part of how order is maintained. Systems that cannot change break under pressure. Systems that can adjust survive. This is why stability in nature is always linked to flexibility. The ability to bend without breaking is more important than remaining rigid. As this story unfolds, we will explore how this principle appears again and again across the natural world. We will see how feedback keeps systems within limits, how ecosystems regulate themselves, how living bodies maintain balance, and how the planet as a whole remains habitable over immense spans of time. For now, it is enough to hold on to one central idea. Nature does not find stability by standing still. It finds stability by moving, adjusting, and responding, moment by moment, without pause. Change is unavoidable in nature because the universe itself is never at rest. Energy is always moving from one place to another. Matter is constantly rearranged. Forces act, interact, and propagate through space. From the smallest scales to the largest, nothing remains fixed for long. This is not a disruption of natural order, it is the condition that makes order possible in the first place. On Earth, nearly all change begins with energy from the sun. Sunlight reaches the surface, warming land and water unevenly. This uneven heating creates differences in temperature and pressure. Air begins to move. Water evaporates, condenses, and falls again. Plants capture light and convert it into chemical energy, which then passes through food webs. Each step involves transformation. Energy enters, energy moves, and energy leaves. The planet is not a closed system. It is constantly exchanging energy with its surroundings, and this exchange guarantees ongoing change. Gravity adds another layer of motion. It pulls matter together, shapes oceans and atmospheres, and drives geological processes. Rivers flow downhill, sediments shift. Tectonic plates move slowly beneath the surface. These movements are not dramatic on short timescales, but over long periods they reshape continents and influence climate. Even solid ground is part of a slow, persistent transformation. Chemical reactions also ensure that nothing remains static. Atoms bond, separate, and recombine according to physical laws. In the atmosphere, gases interact under sunlight. In the oceans, dissolved substances move and react. Inside living cells, thousands of chemical reactions occur every second. Molecules are built, broken down, and replaced. Life depends on this chemical activity. Without it, cells would not function, and organisms could not survive. Because change is constant, stability cannot depend on preventing it. Instead, stability depends on how systems respond to change. A system that resists all variation eventually fails, because it cannot adapt to new conditions. In contrast, systems that allow change within limits are more likely to persist. This is a key distinction. Stability is not about holding a system in place. It is about guiding change so that it remains compatible with continued function. In natural systems, responses to change are often proportional. A small disturbance leads to a small response. A larger disturbance triggers a stronger one. This proportionality helps prevent extremes. If conditions shift slightly, adjustments are subtle. If conditions shift more dramatically, responses become more pronounced. Over time, this responsiveness keeps systems from drifting too far in any single direction. Importantly, this does not mean that nature avoids variation. Seasonal changes are a clear example. Temperatures rise and fall. Rainy periods alternate with dry ones. Many organisms time their growth and reproduction to these cycles. Stability is maintained not by eliminating seasons, but by integrating them into the structure of ecosystems. Variation becomes predictable, and predictability supports persistence. The same principle applies to longer timescales. Climate has changed repeatedly throughout Earth's history. Ice ages have come and gone, sea levels have risen and fallen, species have appeared and disappeared, yet life has continued, adapting to new conditions as they emerged. This continuity exists because biological and physical systems are capable of adjustment. They do not require constant conditions. They require conditions that change within survivable bounds. When viewed this way, change becomes a stabilizing force rather than a destabilizing one. It allows systems to explore different states, discard those that do not work, and reinforce those that do. This process does not involve planning or foresight. It emerges naturally from interaction and feedback. Systems that respond appropriately to change tend to last. Systems that cannot adjust tend to vanish. This perspective also helps explain why nature often appears restless. Winds never stop blowing entirely. Water is always moving somewhere. Populations fluctuate. Landscapes evolve. These movements are not signs of instability. They are signs of regulation in action. Each motion reflects an ongoing response to shifting conditions. As you continue listening, it may help to let go of the idea that balance requires stillness. In nature, balance requires motion. Stability arises not from freezing the world in place, but from allowing it to move in ways that remain coherent. Change is not an interruption of stability, it is the mechanism through which stability is achieved. To understand how nature maintains stability amid constant change, it is necessary to understand feedback. Feedback is the process through which a system responds to the effects of its own activity. In simple terms, something changes. That change produces consequences, and those consequences influence what happens next. This loop between action and response is one of the most fundamental principles underlying stability in the natural world. Feedback does not require awareness or intention. It emerges automatically whenever parts of a system are connected. When temperature changes, physical properties respond. When populations grow, resource availability shifts. When chemical concentrations rise, reaction rates adjust. Each response feeds back into the system, shaping its future behavior. Over time, these feedback loops determine whether a system remains within functional limits or moves toward extremes. In nature, feedback acts as a kind of internal sensing mechanism. Systems do not need external control to detect change. They detect it through their own behavior. A rise in temperature alters pressure. A shortage of nutrients slows growth. An abundance of prey supports larger predator populations. Each of these outcomes influences the next stage of the process. The system effectively measures itself by experiencing the consequences of its own state. What makes feedback so powerful is that it links cause and effect across time. The result of one moment becomes the input for the next. This creates continuity. Without feedback, change would accumulate without restraint. Small deviations would grow unchecked, eventually pushing systems beyond their limits. Feedback provides the structure that prevents this from happening. It is important to note that feedback does not eliminate change. Instead, it shapes it. A system with effective feedback can change direction when necessary. If conditions begin to drift, responses emerge that either slow the drift or redirect it. This responsiveness allows systems to remain stable while still remaining flexible. Feedback operates at every scale of nature. Within a single cell, chemical reactions influence gene activity, which in turn alters future reactions. In ecosystems, population changes affect food availability, which influences reproduction and survival. On a planetary scale, atmospheric composition affects temperature, which influences weather patterns, which then alter atmospheric composition again. These loops overlap and interact, creating layers of regulation. Because feedback is built into natural systems, stability does not require constant conditions. It requires responsive connections. The strength and timing of feedback matter. Responses that are too weak allow drift. Responses that are too strong can overshoot and create oscillations. Most natural systems settle into ranges where feedback is balanced enough to keep change within tolerable bounds. As this story continues, feedback will appear again and again in different forms. It is the quiet mechanism that allows nature to remain recognizable despite constant motion. By responding to its own changes, nature maintains coherence without ever standing still. Among the many forms feedback can take, one plays a particularly important role in maintaining stability. This is known as negative feedback. Despite the name, negative feedback is not harmful or undesirable. It simply describes a response that counteracts change. When a system begins to drift in one direction, negative feedback produces effects that push it back toward a functional range. Negative feedback works by reducing the difference between a system's current state and the conditions it can tolerate. If something increases, the response tends to decrease it. If something decreases, the response tends to increase it. This opposing action prevents extremes from developing. It does not stop variation, but it keeps variation within limits that the system can handle. A familiar example can be found in temperature regulation. When a system becomes warmer, processes that release heat tend to increase. When it becomes cooler, processes that conserve or generate heat become more active. The result is not a perfectly constant temperature, but a narrow range within which the system remains functional. Small fluctuations are allowed. Large deviations are resisted. In ecosystems, negative feedback appears in population dynamics. When a population grows, it consumes more resources. As resources become scarcer, growth slows. Reproduction may decline, survival may decrease, or migration may occur. These responses reduce pressure on the system. If the population becomes too small, resources become more abundant, allowing growth to resume. The population fluctuates, but it does not usually collapse or explode under stable conditions. Negative feedback also operates in chemical systems. When the concentration of a substance increases, reactions that remove it often proceed more rapidly. When the concentration decreases, production pathways become more favorable. These adjustments keep chemical environments within ranges that support ongoing reactions. Without such regulation, chemical systems would quickly reach states that no longer support activity. What makes negative feedback especially important is its stabilizing effect over time. Each response slightly reduces the impact of a disturbance. Over many small adjustments, the system remains within workable boundaries. This does not require precision. It requires consistency. The system does not need to correct perfectly. It only needs to correct often enough. Negative feedback also allows systems to tolerate noise, random fluctuations, unexpected disturbances, and minor disruptions occur constantly. Because negative feedback responds to deviation rather than cause, it can handle disturbances regardless of their origin. This makes stability robust rather than fragile. It is worth noting that negative feedback does not freeze a system in place. The center around which regulation occurs can shift over time. Long-term changes in environment, energy input, or structure can move the functional range itself. Negative feedback then operates around this new range. Stability adapts as conditions change. This ability to restore balance without rigidity is one of the defining features of natural systems. By counteracting extremes while allowing movement, negative feedback provides a foundation for persistence. It is one of the quiet processes through which nature finds stability, not by resisting change entirely, but by guiding it gently back toward what can be sustained. While negative feedback works to soften change and keep systems within workable limits, nature also makes use of another kind of response. This is known as positive feedback. Positive feedback does not oppose change. Instead, it reinforces it. When something begins to increase, positive feedback encourages it to increase further. When something begins to decrease, the response accelerates that decline. This may sound dangerous at first, but positive feedback plays an important and carefully constrained role in natural systems. Positive feedback is most useful when a system needs to move decisively from one state to another. It allows transitions to happen efficiently, rather than slowly drifting without resolution. In these cases, reinforcing change helps a system complete a process instead of lingering in an unstable middle condition. The key is that positive feedback is usually limited in duration or scope. It does its work, then gives way to stabilizing forces. One clear example can be found in physical phase changes. When water begins to freeze, the formation of ice releases heat into the surrounding water. That released heat initially slows further freezing. But once enough ice forms, the structure of the solid phase promotes additional freezing at the boundary. The process accelerates until the transition is complete. Afterward, temperature regulation resumes through other mechanisms. Positive feedback helps complete the change, but it does not operate indefinitely. In biology, positive feedback often appears in processes that must reach a clear outcome. Blood clotting provides a useful illustration. When a blood vessel is damaged, initial clotting signals trigger additional signals that rapidly strengthen the clot. This amplification ensures that bleeding stops efficiently. Once the clot is formed, the process shuts down. Other mechanisms then prevent excessive clotting. Here again, positive feedback is tightly controlled and temporary. Population dynamics can also include short periods of positive feedback. When conditions are favorable, a population may grow rapidly. Abundant resources support higher reproduction, which increases population size further. This acceleration continues until limiting factors appear. Resources become scarcer, waste accumulates, or competition intensifies. At that point, negative feedback takes over, slowing growth and restoring balance. The system shifts from amplification to regulation. Positive feedback becomes problematic only when it escapes these natural limits. If reinforcing loops continue without restraint, systems can move toward extremes that are difficult to reverse. In nature, this is relatively rare under stable background conditions because most systems are embedded within larger networks of feedback. Amplification in one area tends to trigger counteracting responses elsewhere. This interconnectedness prevents runaway behavior from becoming the norm. It is important to recognize that positive feedback is not a mistake or a flaw. It is a tool that nature uses sparingly and strategically. Without it, certain changes would be too slow or incomplete to be functional. Systems would hover uncertainly between states, vulnerable to disruption. Positive feedback allows clarity of transition. It pushes systems decisively when a shift is already underway. At the same time, positive feedback alone cannot sustain stability. Its role is complementary. It works alongside negative feedback, not in opposition to it. One amplifies change when necessary. The other restrains change to keep systems viable. Stability emerges not from choosing one over the other, but from the balance between them. Understanding this balance helps clarify why nature can appear calm at times and volatile at others. Periods of relative steadiness are often governed by negative feedback, quietly maintaining limits. Periods of rapid change often involve bursts of positive feedback driving transitions. Both are part of the same regulatory landscape. As this story continues, these ideas will reappear in many forms. Ecosystems, organisms, and even planetary systems rely on the careful interplay between reinforcement and restraint. Stability does not mean preventing acceleration. It means ensuring that acceleration occurs only when it can be absorbed and eventually brought back into balance. This combination of flexibility and control is one of the reasons nature remains resilient over time. When these principles of feedback are applied to entire ecosystems, stability begins to look less like balance on a scale and more like a continuous negotiation between living organisms and their surroundings. Ecosystems are not managed from above. There is no central control deciding how many plants should grow or how many animals should survive. Instead, regulation emerges from countless interactions taking place at the same time, each one small on its own, but powerful in combination. One of the clearest examples of this self-regulation appears in the relationship between predators and prey. When prey populations increase, food becomes more abundant for predators. Predator numbers may then rise, increasing pressure on the prey population. As prey becomes less abundant, predators face greater difficulty finding food. Their numbers may decline or their behavior may change. This reduces pressure on the prey population, allowing it to recover. Neither population remains fixed, yet neither usually disappears. The system fluctuates within limits shaped by availability, energy costs, and survival. These interactions extend far beyond simple predator and prey pairs. Plants respond to soil nutrients, water availability, and light. Herbivores respond to plant growth and quality. Decomposers respond to organic matter produced by all other organisms. Each response alters conditions for others. The result is a web of feedback loops layered on top of one another. Stability does not depend on any single relationship holding steady. It depends on the network as a whole remaining responsive. Resource availability plays a central role in this regulation. When resources are plentiful, growth is encouraged. When resources become scarce, growth slows. This pattern applies across ecosystems, whether in forests, grasslands, oceans, or wetlands. Importantly, scarcity is not an error in the system. It is one of the signals that guides behavior and limits excess. Without scarcity, populations would grow beyond what the environment could support, eventually leading to collapse. Ecosystems also regulate themselves through spatial organization. Organisms spread out, migrate, or change their activity patterns in response to local conditions. This redistribution reduces pressure in crowded areas and allows recovery where resources have been depleted. Movement, rather than permanence, becomes a stabilizing force. Even plants participate in this process over longer timescales through seed dispersal and gradual shifts in distribution. Disturbances such as fires, storms, or floods may seem at odds with stability, but they are often integrated into ecosystem regulation. These events remove accumulated material, redistribute nutrients, and create opportunities for renewal. While they alter the appearance of an ecosystem, they do not necessarily undermine its ability to function. In many cases, systems that experience regular disturbance are more resilient than those that do not, because their regulatory mechanisms remain active and adaptable. What emerges from all of this is a different picture of balance. Ecosystems do not maintain stability by remaining unchanged. They maintain it by continuously responding to internal and external pressures. Populations rise and fall, species come and go, conditions vary from year to year, yet the system persists because its components remain connected through feedback. This form of stability is not fragile. It does not depend on precise numbers or fixed arrangements. It depends on relationships. As long as organisms can respond to changes in resources, competition, and conditions, the system remains viable. Stability, in this sense, is not a static outcome. It is an ongoing process of adjustment that never truly stops. Within every ecosystem, growth is always shaped by limits. No population, no matter how successful or well adapted, can expand without restraint forever. This is not because nature imposes rules deliberately, but because resources are finite and conditions are always changing. These limits are not flaws in the system. They are among the most important forces that allow ecosystems to remain stable over long periods of time. When conditions are favorable, populations tend to grow. Food is available, space is sufficient, and survival rates increase. At first, this growth can seem smooth and even predictable. More individuals are born than die, and numbers rise steadily. Yet growth itself begins to alter the environment in which it occurs. As population size increases, demand for resources rises as well. More food is consumed, more space is occupied, and more waste is produced. These changes feed back into the system and begin to influence survival and reproduction. As density increases, competition becomes more intense. Individuals must work harder to obtain food or territory. Stress increases, and vulnerability to disease often rises as organisms live closer together. Predators may respond to higher prey density, increasing pressure on the population. None of these effects occur suddenly. They build gradually as growth continues. Eventually, the conditions that once supported expansion begin to slow it down. This slowing is not a failure of the population. It is a form of regulation. Reproduction rates may decline. Offspring may have lower survival. Some individuals may disperse to new areas, reducing local density. Others may not survive at all. These outcomes reduce pressure on the environment and allow resources time to recover. Growth slows or reverses, and the population settles into a pattern of fluctuation rather than continuous increase. The concept often used to describe this balance is carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is not a fixed number written into the landscape. It is a range shaped by available resources, environmental conditions, and interactions with other species. That range shifts over time. Seasonal changes, climate variation, and disturbances all influence how many individuals an environment can support at any given moment. Stability does not require populations to remain constant. It requires them to adjust to these shifting conditions. Limits also play an important role in maintaining diversity. When growth is constrained, no single species can dominate indefinitely. Competition prevents unchecked expansion. This opens space for other organisms to persist, each occupying a slightly different role within the ecosystem. Some specialize in particular resources. Others thrive under specific conditions. This diversity spreads demand across the system, reducing the risk that any single disturbance will cause widespread failure. In this way, limits support resilience. A system with multiple species and overlapping functions can absorb shocks more effectively than one dominated by a single population. If one species declines, others may fill similar roles, allowing the ecosystem to continue functioning. Limits prevent overdependence on any single component. It is important to recognize that these constraints are not imposed from outside. They arise naturally from interaction. As populations grow, they change their surroundings. Those changes feed back into population dynamics. The system regulates itself through cause and effect rather than command and control. This self-regulation does not aim for perfection, it aims for persistence. Without limits, growth would overshoot what the environment can support. Resources would be depleted faster than they could be renewed. Conditions would deteriorate until collapse occurred. Limits prevent this outcome by slowing growth before irreversible damage is done. They keep systems within ranges that allow recovery and continuation. Seen this way, restriction becomes a stabilizing force rather than an obstacle. It channels growth into patterns that can be sustained over time. Nature does not promise unlimited expansion. It offers continuity through constraint. By shaping growth and preventing excess, limits help ecosystems remain viable across generations. Stability is maintained not by allowing everything to grow without bound, but by ensuring that growth remains compatible with the environment that supports it. Stability in nature is not measured by the absence of disturbance, but by the ability to recover from it. This quality is often described as resilience. A resilient system can absorb shocks, reorganize, and continue functioning without losing its core structure. Disturbance, rather than being an exception, is a regular part of how natural systems operate. Storms, fires, floods, droughts, and disease outbreaks all test the limits of stability. What matters is not whether these events occur, but how systems respond when they do. In many ecosystems, disturbance plays a constructive role. A fire may remove accumulated plant material, releasing nutrients back into the soil. A storm may open gaps in a forest canopy, allowing sunlight to reach the ground and support new growth. Flooding can redistribute sediments and nutrients across a landscape. These events change the appearance of an ecosystem, sometimes dramatically, but they do not necessarily undermine its ability to function. In fact, systems that experience regular disturbance often develop structures that allow them to recover more effectively. Resilience depends on diversity, flexibility, and redundancy. When an ecosystem contains many species performing similar roles, the loss or decline of one does not automatically lead to collapse. Other organisms can compensate, at least partially, maintaining essential processes such as energy flow, nutrient cycling, and population regulation. This overlap does not make systems inefficient, it makes them durable. Redundancy provides options when conditions change. Flexibility also matters. Species that can adjust their behavior, timing, or resource use are better able to cope with unexpected conditions. Some plants can survive periods of drought by slowing growth or entering dormant states. Some animals alter migration patterns, diet, or activity levels in response to changing conditions. These adjustments reduce stress during unfavorable periods and allow recovery when conditions improve. Resilience is closely tied to feedback. After a disturbance, feedback mechanisms guide recovery. Reduced competition may allow surviving organisms to grow more quickly. Increased resource availability can support reproduction. As populations recover, negative feedback gradually slows growth again, preventing overshoot. The system does not return to its previous state exactly. Instead, it moves toward a new configuration that fits current conditions. It is important to understand that recovery does not always mean restoration. An ecosystem after disturbance may differ in composition or structure from what came before. Some species may be lost, others gained. The pathway of recovery depends on the severity of the disturbance and the surrounding context. Stability, in this sense, is not about preserving a fixed arrangement. It is about maintaining function through change. Time plays a critical role in resilience. Some systems recover quickly, within months or years. Others require decades or longer. What appears unstable over short periods may be stable when viewed across appropriate timescales. This perspective helps explain why natural systems can tolerate variability that might seem alarming when observed moment by moment. Resilience also has limits. Disturbances that are too frequent or too severe can overwhelm recovery mechanisms. If feedback cannot operate effectively, systems may shift into new states that function differently or support different forms of life. These shifts are not necessarily failures, but they do represent changes in stability. The capacity to recover depends on the balance between disturbance and response. Understanding resilience reinforces a central theme of this story. Stability in nature is not about resisting change at all costs. It is about maintaining the ability to respond. Systems persist not because they are protected from disturbance, but because they are shaped by it. Each challenge activates processes of adjustment and recovery. Through this ongoing interaction between disruption and response, nature maintains continuity even in a world that is always changing. After a disturbance has altered an ecosystem, stability does not return all at once. Instead, it emerges gradually through a process known as succession. Succession describes the way living communities reorganize over time, moving from simpler arrangements toward more complex and stable ones. This process reveals an important truth about nature. Stability is not about going backward to what once existed. It is about moving forward into a configuration that fits the conditions that now exist. When a landscape is cleared by fire, flood, volcanic activity, or human disturbance, it may appear empty at first. Soil may be exposed, nutrients unevenly distributed, and conditions harsh. Yet this apparent emptiness is temporary. The first organisms to arrive are often those that can tolerate extremes. Fast-growing plants, microbes, and hardy species begin to occupy the space. They stabilize soil, retain moisture, and start cycling nutrients. Their presence alters conditions, making the environment more hospitable for others. As conditions improve, new species arrive. Some outcompete the early colonizers, while others coexist alongside them. Plant cover increases, organic matter accumulates, and soil structure improves. Animals follow, attracted by food and shelter. Each stage of this process changes the environment in subtle ways. Light levels shift, nutrient availability changes, microclimates form. These changes influence which species can thrive next. The system guides its own development through feedback. Succession does not follow a strict script. While general patterns exist, the exact path depends on local conditions. Climate, soil composition, surrounding ecosystems, and the severity of the initial disturbance all shape the outcome. Two areas disturbed in similar ways may develop differently over time. Stability does not require uniformity. It allows for variation within broad constraints. What remains consistent is the direction of the process. Over time, energy use becomes more efficient. Nutrient cycles become tighter. Biomass increases. Interactions among species become more interconnected. These changes reduce vulnerability to minor disturbances. The system becomes better able to regulate itself. This is what is meant by increasing stability. It is not a fixed endpoint, but a trend toward greater coherence. Importantly, the final state reached through succession is not permanent. It remains open to change. A mature forest can still burn. A grassland can still flood. Succession prepares systems to recover, not to avoid disturbance altogether. When disruption occurs again, the process begins anew, often drawing on remnants of what came before. Seeds, roots, and surviving organisms provide continuity, linking past and future states. Succession also illustrates how stability and change are inseparable. Each stage depends on change to create the conditions for the next. Early colonizers modify the environment in ways that eventually limit their own success. Later species depend on those modifications but bring new changes of their own. This sequence is driven by feedback, competition, and cooperation. Stability emerges from this progression, not despite it. At a broader scale, succession shapes entire landscapes. Over long periods, patterns of disturbance and recovery create mosaics of ecosystems at different stages. This diversity of states increases overall resilience. When one area is disturbed, others remain intact, providing sources for recolonization. Stability is distributed across space as well as time. Understanding succession helps clarify a common misunderstanding. Stability does not mean preservation of a specific appearance. It means preservation of function and continuity. A forest does not need to look the same decade after decade to be stable. It needs to continue cycling nutrients, supporting life, and responding to change. Succession allows this to happen by aligning structure with current conditions. Through this lens, disturbance is not the opposite of order. It is part of the process by which order reorganizes itself. Succession shows how systems move forward after disruption, not by erasing change, but by incorporating it. Stability arises not from holding on to the past, but from the capacity to build coherence out of what remains. Diversity plays a quiet but powerful role in how natural systems maintain stability. An ecosystem with many different species is often better able to withstand change than one dominated by only a few. This is not because diversity prevents disturbance, but because it spreads risk across the system. When conditions shift, not all organisms respond in the same way. Some struggle, others persist, and a few may even benefit. This variation in response helps keep essential processes running. In a diverse ecosystem, different species often perform similar functions in slightly different ways. Multiple plants may capture sunlight and produce biomass. Several animals may consume the same type of food, but at different times or in different places. Microorganisms may break down organic matter using different pathways. This overlap is sometimes described as redundancy, but it is better understood as flexibility built into the system. If one component is weakened or removed, others can compensate, at least partially. The system does not rely on a single solution. Diversity also allows ecosystems to respond to a wider range of conditions. Species differ in their tolerance to temperature, moisture, and nutrient availability. Some thrive in wet years, others in dry ones. Some are resilient to heat, others to cold. As conditions vary, the balance among species shifts. The overall system continues to function because different members take the lead under different circumstances. Stability emerges from this shifting participation rather than from uniform performance. At the level of interactions, diversity reduces the likelihood of runaway effects. When one species increases rapidly, it encounters a variety of competitors, predators, and parasites. These interactions limit unchecked growth and distribute pressure across multiple pathways. In simpler systems with fewer species, feedback may be weaker or more direct, increasing the risk of extreme fluctuations. Complexity, in this case, acts as a buffer. Diversity also influences how energy and nutrients move through ecosystems. Multiple pathways allow materials to circulate even if one route is disrupted. If a particular decomposer declines, others may continue breaking down organic matter. If a pollinator becomes scarce, alternative pollinators may still support reproduction. This circulation prevents bottlenecks and helps maintain continuity in essential cycles. Importantly, diversity itself is shaped by limits and feedback. Not every species can persist everywhere. Competition, environmental constraints, and disturbance determine which organisms can coexist. Diversity does not grow without bound. It stabilizes within ranges that the environment can support. This balance between variety and constraint contributes to long-term resilience. The benefits of diversity become especially clear after disturbance. Systems with many species often recover more quickly because some organisms are already suited to the new conditions. They begin the process of reorganization, creating opportunities for others to follow. In contrast, systems with low diversity may struggle to adapt, as fewer options are available. Recovery may be slower or lead to more drastic change. Diversity also operates across scales. Genetic diversity within a species supports adaptation over generations. Species diversity within communities supports resilience to environmental change. Landscape diversity, with different habitats and stages of succession, spreads risk across space. Stability arises from this layering of variation, not from uniformity at any single level. It is important to recognize that diversity does not guarantee stability under all circumstances. Extreme or persistent disturbances can overwhelm even highly diverse systems. However, diversity increases the range of responses available. It buys time, It allows systems to absorb shocks and reorganize rather than collapse immediately. In this sense, diversity supports stability by keeping options open. Seen together, these patterns reinforce a central idea. Stability in nature is not achieved by simplifying systems or eliminating variation. It is achieved by allowing complexity to develop within limits. Diversity creates multiple pathways for adjustment. It spreads risk and supports recovery. Through this quiet distribution of roles and responses, nature finds stability not by becoming uniform, but by remaining richly varied. Stability is not only a property of ecosystems and landscapes, it is also a defining feature of living bodies themselves. Every organism exists within a narrow range of internal conditions that must be maintained for life to continue. Temperature, acidity, water balance, and the concentration of countless chemicals all need to remain within limits. The process that keeps these conditions stable is known as homeostasis. Like stability in nature more broadly, homeostasis is not passive. It depends on constant monitoring and adjustment. Within a living body, conditions are always shifting. Energy is used and replenished. Heat is produced and lost. Molecules are built, broken down, and replaced. Cells divide, age, and are removed. If these changes were allowed to proceed without regulation, the internal environment would quickly become incompatible with life. Homeostasis prevents this by linking change to response. When a variable begins to drift, corrective processes are activated. Consider body temperature. Heat is generated by metabolism and lost to the surrounding environment. When temperature rises, mechanisms that increase heat loss become more active. Blood flow to the skin increases. Sweat may be produced. When temperature falls, heat loss is reduced and heat production may increase. Muscles may generate warmth through movement. These responses do not aim to hold temperature at a single exact value. They aim to keep it within a range that allows biochemical processes to function properly. Similar regulation applies to water balance. Water enters the body through food and drink and leaves through respiration, waste, and evaporation. Changes in hydration affect blood volume and chemical concentrations. Sensors detect these changes and adjust thirst, kidney function, and hormone release accordingly. The result is not perfect constancy, but stability over time. Homeostasis also operates at smaller scales. Individual cells regulate their internal chemistry despite constant exchange with their surroundings. They control the movement of ions, maintain energy balance, and repair damage as it occurs. These processes rely on feedback and consume energy. Stability requires work. It is something the organism actively maintains. Importantly, homeostasis allows flexibility. Internal set points can shift in response to long-term changes. Acclimation to temperature, altitude, or activity level alters how regulation occurs. Stability adapts to context. This adaptability is what allows organisms to survive in varied environments rather than only under ideal conditions. When homeostasis fails, the consequences become visible quickly. Illness, stress, and injury often involve disruptions to internal regulation. Recovery depends on restoring balance, not by eliminating change, but by re-establishing responsive control. The body heals by adjusting, compensating, and reorganizing. Homeostasis illustrates a core principle that appears throughout this story. Stability is not a static condition achieved once and held forever. It is an ongoing process sustained by feedback, energy use, and responsiveness. Living bodies persist not because nothing changes within them, but because they are structured to respond continuously to change. Through this quiet, constant regulation, life maintains itself moment by moment. Maintaining internal stability would not be possible without coordination. In complex organisms, this coordination is provided primarily by the nervous system and the hormonal, or endocrine, system. Together, these systems detect changes, transmit information, and trigger responses that help keep the internal environment within workable limits. They operate at different speeds and scales, but their roles are complementary. The nervous system is responsible for rapid communication. Specialized cells detect changes in temperature, pressure, chemical composition, and other variables. These signals travel quickly through neural pathways, allowing the body to respond within fractions of a second. Muscles contract, glands release substances, and organs adjust their activity almost immediately. This speed is essential when conditions change suddenly, such as during physical exertion or exposure to extreme temperatures. The hormonal system works more slowly, but its effects last longer. Hormones are chemical messengers released into the bloodstream. They travel throughout the body, influencing the activity of distant tissues. Hormonal signals help regulate growth, metabolism, energy storage, reproduction, and stress responses. Because hormones persist in circulation, they provide sustained regulation rather than rapid correction. This slower pace allows the body to adapt to longer-term changes in conditions. Together, these systems form layered feedback networks. A change in one part of the body can influence many others, creating coordinated responses. For example, changes in energy availability affect hormone release, which alters appetite, metabolism, and activity levels. Neural signals may adjust behavior at the same time, encouraging rest or movement. These combined responses help restore balance without relying on any single mechanism. Importantly, neither system aims for perfection. They operate within ranges, tolerating variability while preventing extremes. Responses are often proportional rather than exact. This allows flexibility. Small deviations trigger modest adjustments. Larger deviations produce stronger responses. Over time, this proportional regulation supports stability without rigidity. The nervous and hormonal systems also interact closely. Neural signals can trigger hormone release, and hormones can influence neural activity. This interaction allows fine-tuning across timescales. Immediate needs are addressed quickly, while longer-term adjustments shape ongoing regulation. This coordination illustrates another key feature of stability in living systems. Control is distributed rather than centralized. No single signal dictates the entire response. Instead, stability emerges from the interaction of many signals acting together. Through this distributed regulation, organisms maintain internal balance in a constantly changing world, adjusting moment by moment without ever truly standing still. Energy balance is a central requirement for stability in all living organisms. Every process that sustains life depends on energy. Movement, growth, repair, communication between cells, and regulation of internal conditions all require a continuous supply. At the same time, energy availability is rarely constant. Food intake varies, activity levels fluctuate, and environmental conditions influence how much energy is needed at any given moment. Stability emerges from the ability to manage this variability over time. Living organisms solve this problem by separating immediate energy use from long-term energy balance. Energy is not consumed the moment it is acquired. Instead, it is processed, stored, and released according to need. When intake exceeds demand, excess energy is converted into chemical forms that can be stored. When demand exceeds intake, those stores are accessed. This buffering capacity allows organisms to survive periods of scarcity without immediate failure. Stability depends not on uninterrupted supply, but on flexible management. Regulation of energy balance relies on feedback. Sensors within the body detect changes in nutrient availability, energy stores, and metabolic activity. These signals influence appetite, digestion, hormone release, and overall energy expenditure. When energy reserves decline, hunger increases, and the body may reduce energy use in non-essential processes. When reserves are abundant, appetite may decrease, and energy may be directed towards storage, growth, or reproduction. These responses are not exact calculations. They are approximate adjustments that keep the system within a survivable range. Energy balance also unfolds across multiple timescales. On a daily scale, organisms adjust to cycles of activity and rest. Short bursts of exertion are followed by recovery. Over longer periods, energy regulation adapts to seasons, life stages, and environmental pressures. Many animals increase energy storage before periods of limited food availability. Others reduce activity or alter behavior to conserve energy. These strategies allow continuity through predictable challenges. Crucially, energy balance is tightly linked to other regulatory systems. Temperature control, immune response, tissue repair, and hormonal regulation all depend on adequate energy supply. When energy balance is disrupted, these systems become strained. This interdependence means that energy regulation acts as a foundation for stability throughout the organism. Maintaining balance in one area supports balance in others. Perfect equilibrium is neither possible nor required. Organisms regularly experience short-term surpluses and deficits. What matters is compensation over time. Systems that can absorb fluctuation and adjust accordingly remain viable. Those that cannot are more vulnerable to stress, illness, and failure. Through this continuous adjustment of intake, storage, and use, living organisms maintain stability without requiring constant conditions. Energy balance reflects a broader pattern seen throughout nature. Stability is achieved not by eliminating variability, but by responding to it effectively, allowing life to persist in an environment that is always changing. Beneath the visible processes of energy balance and physiological regulation lies a deeper layer of stability operating at the level of individual cells. Each cell functions in an environment defined by constant motion and unavoidable damage. Molecules collide, reactions generate heat, and byproducts accumulate. External stresses such as radiation, chemical exposure, and mechanical strain add further challenges. Stability at this scale does not arise from avoiding disturbance, but from anticipating it. Cells are structured around the expectation that errors will occur. Proteins lose their shape, membranes degrade, and genetic material experiences damage during normal operation. Rather than treating these events as failures, cells incorporate repair and replacement into their everyday activity. Damaged proteins are identified and broken down. New proteins are synthesized to replace them. DNA repair systems continuously scan genetic material, correcting many errors before they can interfere with cellular function. These processes run constantly, forming a background layer of maintenance that supports long-term stability. Turnover is essential to this process. Very few cellular components are meant to last indefinitely. Most are temporary, replaced on timescales ranging from minutes to days. This constant renewal prevents the accumulation of small defects that could otherwise compromise function. Stability is achieved not by preserving materials unchanged, but by renewing them before damage becomes critical. Cells also regulate their internal environment through selective barriers and transport systems. Concentrations of ions, acidity, and energy molecules are maintained within narrow limits, despite continuous exchange with the surrounding environment. When conditions shift, feedback mechanisms adjust transport rates and metabolic pathways accordingly. If energy demand increases, production pathways accelerate. If waste accumulates, removal processes intensify. These responses are proportional rather than absolute, allowing flexibility without loss of control. When damage exceeds repair capacity, cells have additional safeguards. They may reduce activity, enter dormant states, or initiate controlled self-removal. This prevents malfunctioning cells from disrupting surrounding tissue. At a larger scale, this contributes to stability by protecting the integrity of the system as a whole, even when individual components fail. Cellular stability illustrates a recurring theme throughout nature. Persistence does not depend on perfection. It depends on responsiveness. By anticipating damage, correcting errors, and renewing structure, cells maintain function over time. These microscopic processes form the foundation upon which tissues, organs, and entire organisms depend. Stability at higher levels would not be possible without this continuous, quiet work occurring at the smallest scales. Stability over long periods of time depends not only on moment-to-moment regulation, but also on the capacity of living systems to adjust across generations. This broader form of stability is shaped by adaptation and evolution. While homeostasis keeps individual organisms functioning within their lifetimes, evolution allows populations to remain viable, as environments change over centuries and longer spans. Together, these processes connect short-term balance with long-term persistence. Environments are never perfectly constant. Climate shifts, landscapes change, and new interactions emerge as species move, compete, or disappear. Conditions that once supported a population may gradually become less favorable. If organisms were locked into a single way of functioning, stability would eventually fail. Evolution provides a solution by allowing populations to change their characteristics over time, aligning biological function with current conditions. Adaptation begins with variation. Within any population, individuals differ slightly in their traits. These differences affect how well they survive and reproduce under specific conditions. When the environment changes, some traits become more advantageous than others. Individuals carrying those traits are more likely to leave offspring. Over many generations, these traits become more common within the population. This process does not aim for improvement in an abstract sense. It favors compatibility with the present environment. From the perspective of stability, this gradual adjustment is crucial. Evolution does not eliminate change, it tracks it. As conditions shift, populations shift as well, remaining within ranges that allow continued existence. Stability emerges not from resisting environmental pressure, but from responding to it across time. Species that cannot adjust eventually decline. Those that can persist, even as conditions move away from what once seemed ideal. Importantly, evolution operates within constraints. Physical laws, developmental pathways, and energetic limits shape what kinds of changes are possible. Adaptation does not produce unlimited flexibility. It produces workable solutions within defined boundaries. This constraint prevents biological systems from drifting into forms that cannot function. Stability, once again, depends on limits as much as on variation. Evolution also interacts with other stabilizing processes. Changes in population traits influence ecosystem dynamics, which in turn alter selective pressures. Feedback loops extend across generations, linking biological change to environmental response. Over time, these interactions shape not only individual species, but entire communities. Stability becomes a property of the system rather than of any single component. It is important to recognize that evolutionary stability does not mean permanence. Species appear and disappear, lineages branch, merge, or end. What persists is not a particular form, but the capacity of life to reorganize itself. This continuity exists because evolutionary processes allow systems to explore different configurations while remaining grounded in functional constraints. Adaptation also highlights the difference between short-term disruption and long-term stability. A rapid environmental change may stress a population, causing decline in the short term. Over longer periods, however, adaptive responses may restore viability. The timescale matters. Stability cannot always be judged by immediate outcomes. It often becomes visible only when viewed across many generations. Through evolution, nature maintains stability without freezing itself in place. Populations adjust, ecosystems reorganize, and life continues under new conditions. This process is slow, cumulative, and indifferent to individual outcomes, yet it supports persistence at larger scales. Stability, in this context, is not about preserving the present. It is about ensuring that life remains possible as the present becomes the past. When attention shifts from living organisms to the planet as a whole, stability takes on a broader meaning. Earth itself functions as an interconnected system, shaped by the constant interaction between land, oceans, atmosphere, and life. None of these components operates independently. Each influences the others through ongoing exchanges of energy and matter. Stability at the planetary scale emerges from this interaction, not from any single controlling force. The Earth receives energy primarily from the Sun. This energy enters the system as radiation, warms the surface unevenly, and drives motion throughout the planet. Air circulates as warm regions release heat and cooler regions absorb it. Water evaporates, condenses, and moves across the globe. Living organisms capture a portion of this energy and convert it into chemical form, influencing atmospheric composition and surface conditions. At the same time, energy leaves the planet as heat radiates back into space. This continuous flow prevents indefinite accumulation and sets boundaries within which planetary processes operate. Matter behaves differently from energy. While energy flows through the system, matter is largely recycled. Elements such as carbon, nitrogen, and water move repeatedly between air, oceans, land, and living organisms. These cycles link biological activity with physical and chemical processes. Plants draw carbon from the atmosphere. Animals consume plants and release carbon through respiration. Microorganisms return carbon to soil and water. Geological processes store and release it over longer timescales. Stability arises because these movements are interconnected. A change in one part of the cycle influences others. At the planetary level, feedback plays a central role. When conditions begin to drift, responses emerge that influence the direction of change. Increased temperatures alter evaporation rates, cloud formation, and atmospheric circulation. Changes in ocean temperature influence currents and heat distribution. Biological responses affect gas concentrations and surface reflectivity. These interactions do not guarantee perfect balance, but they constrain extremes. They shape how far and how fast conditions can move. Importantly, planetary stability does not imply uniformity. Earth's surface is highly varied. Deserts, forests, oceans, ice, and mountains coexist under very different local conditions. Stability emerges not by making all regions the same, but by allowing diversity within global limits. Energy is redistributed across space, smoothing the most extreme contrasts while preserving regional differences. This distribution supports a wide range of environments without allowing the system to fragment. Time also plays a critical role at this scale. Some planetary responses occur quickly, such as changes in weather patterns. Others unfold slowly, such as shifts in ocean circulation or geological restructuring. Stability depends on the interaction of fast and slow processes. Rapid responses address immediate changes, while slower processes provide long-term regulation. Together, they prevent short-term disturbances from permanently destabilizing the system. Life itself is part of this regulation. Biological activity influences atmospheric composition, surface chemistry, and energy flow. In turn, planetary conditions shape where and how life can exist. This mutual influence has developed over immense spans of time. It does not imply intention or design. It reflects the accumulation of interactions that reinforce compatible conditions. When viewed as a whole, Earth's stability is not the absence of change. It is the persistence of relationships that keep the system within ranges that allow continuity. Continents drift, climates shift, and life evolves, yet the planet remains a coherent system rather than dissolving into extremes. This coherence arises from constant interaction, feedback, and constraint. Understanding Earth as a regulating system reinforces a central idea of this story. Stability is not imposed from outside. It emerges from connection. At the planetary scale, as at all others, nature finds stability not by standing still, but by remaining engaged in continuous exchange. One of the most important contributors to planetary stability is the atmosphere. Though thin compared to the size of the planet, it plays a decisive role in regulating temperature, distributing energy, and supporting life. The atmosphere is not a static shell. It is a dynamic, moving system that responds continuously to changes at Earth's surface and beyond. Stability emerges from this motion, not despite it. The atmosphere moderates temperature by controlling how energy enters and leaves the planet. Incoming solar radiation warms the surface, while outgoing heat is radiated back into space. Certain gases absorb and re-emit a portion of this heat, slowing its escape. This process prevents Earth from becoming too cold to support liquid water and life. At the same time, the atmosphere does not trap all heat indefinitely. Energy continues to leave the system, preventing unchecked warming. Stability arises from this balance between retention and release. Air movement is equally important. Uneven heating creates differences in air density and pressure. Warm air rises, cool air sinks, and these motions drive winds and large-scale circulation patterns. Energy absorbed in one region is transported to others, reducing extreme contrasts between equator and poles, land and sea, day and night. Without this redistribution, temperature differences would be far more severe. The atmosphere smooths extremes while preserving regional variation, allowing diverse environments to coexist. Moisture within the atmosphere adds another layer of regulation. Water vapor absorbs heat, influences cloud formation, and participates in the water cycle. Clouds reflect some incoming sunlight, while also trapping heat near the surface. Their net effect varies depending on altitude, composition, and location. This variability adds complexity, but it also contributes to resilience. The atmosphere does not rely on a single mechanism. Multiple overlapping processes influence energy balance, reducing dependence on any one pathway. The atmosphere also responds to biological activity. Plants remove carbon dioxide from the air and release oxygen. Microorganisms influence other gases through metabolic processes. Over long periods, these biological contributions have reshaped atmospheric composition. In turn, atmospheric conditions influence which forms of life can persist. This mutual influence links living systems with planetary regulation, reinforcing stability through interaction rather than control. Time again plays a crucial role. Some atmospheric responses occur quickly. Winds shift within hours, clouds form and dissipate. Weather patterns change from day to day. Other responses unfold more slowly. Long-term changes in gas concentrations or circulation patterns may take decades or longer. Stability depends on the interaction of these fast and slow processes. Rapid responses address immediate variation. Slower ones shape long-term trends. It is important to recognize that atmospheric stability does not mean unchanging conditions. Variability is inherent. Storms, heat waves, and cold spells are natural expressions of atmospheric dynamics. These events test the limits of regulation, but they do not usually overwhelm it. The atmosphere absorbs variation through motion and redistribution, maintaining overall coherence. When viewed in isolation, atmospheric behavior can seem chaotic. Patterns shift constantly, and exact outcomes are difficult to predict. Yet at the system level, this apparent disorder contributes to stability. Countless small motions combine to produce reliable large-scale behavior. Energy continues to flow. Extremes are moderated. Life remains possible. The atmosphere exemplifies a recurring theme in nature. Stability is not achieved by suppressing movement, it depends on it. By remaining in motion, responding to change, and redistributing energy, the atmosphere helps keep the planet within ranges that support continuity. It is through this restless activity that stability is maintained. The oceans play an equally important role in maintaining planetary stability, though their influence is often less visible than that of the atmosphere. Covering most of Earth's surface, the oceans act as vast reservoirs of heat, matter, and motion. Their ability to absorb, store, and redistribute energy makes them one of the strongest stabilizing forces on the planet. Like other natural systems, oceanic stability does not arise from stillness, but from slow, persistent movement. Water has a high capacity to absorb heat without changing temperature rapidly. This property allows the oceans to take in large amounts of energy during warm periods and release it gradually over time. As a result, temperature changes at the surface are moderated. Coastal regions experience smaller temperature swings than inland areas, and seasonal extremes are softened. Without the oceans, Earth's climate would be far more volatile, with sharper transitions between hot and cold conditions. Ocean circulation extends this stabilizing effect across the globe. Surface currents move warm water from equatorial regions toward higher latitudes, while cooler water flows back toward the equator at depth. This circulation links distant regions into a single system. Energy absorbed in one part of the world influences conditions elsewhere, often months or years later. The oceans operate on long timescales, smoothing variability that would otherwise remain localized and extreme. Vertical movement within the oceans also contributes to stability. Cold, dense water sinks, while warmer water rises. This mixing distributes heat and nutrients through the water column. Nutrients brought up from deeper layers support surface ecosystems, while sinking organic matter transfers energy and carbon downward. These exchanges connect biological activity with physical circulation, reinforcing stability through interaction. The oceans also absorb significant amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater and participates in chemical reactions that store it in different forms. Some of this carbon is taken up by marine organisms, incorporated into shells or organic matter, and eventually transported to deeper layers. This process operates slowly, but it reduces short-term fluctuations in atmospheric carbon levels. Stability at the planetary scale depends on such delayed responses, which dampen rapid change. Importantly, oceanic regulation is not uniform. Different regions respond differently depending on depth, circulation patterns, and biological activity. Some areas exchange heat and gases with the atmosphere quickly. Others act as long-term reservoirs, releasing stored energy only after extended periods. This diversity of response times adds resilience. The system does not rely on a single pathway or speed. Multiple processes overlap, reducing vulnerability to disruption. Ocean stability is also influenced by feedback. Changes in temperature affect water density, which alters circulation patterns. Circulation changes influence heat distribution, which feeds back into temperature. Biological responses interact with these physical changes, modifying chemical composition and light absorption. These feedback loops do not eliminate variability, but they constrain how far conditions can drift. They shape the pace and direction of change rather than preventing it entirely. Disturbances occur in ocean systems just as they do elsewhere. Storms mix surface waters. Shifts in circulation alter regional climates. Changes in nutrient availability influence marine ecosystems. These events may disrupt local conditions, but they do not usually undermine the system's capacity to function. The oceans absorb shocks through their size, depth, and slow dynamics. Recovery may take time, but regulation continues. The oceans illustrate another important aspect of stability. Some stabilizing processes work best when they are slow. Rapid responses address immediate variation. Slow responses provide memory. By storing heat and carbon over long periods, the oceans connect present conditions with the past and future. This memory prevents abrupt shifts from dominating planetary behavior. Through their vast capacity and continuous motion, the oceans help keep Earth within ranges that support life. They do not enforce balance through rigidity, they do so through persistence. By absorbing change, redistributing energy, and releasing it gradually, the oceans act as a stabilizing background against which other processes unfold. In this quiet, steady way, they contribute profoundly to how nature finds stability at the scale of the planet. Among the slow processes that support planetary stability, the movement of carbon through Earth's systems plays a central role. Carbon is not fixed in one place. It moves continuously between the atmosphere, oceans, living organisms, and the solid Earth. This movement, known as the carbon cycle, links biological activity with physical and geological processes across a wide range of timescales. Stability emerges not because carbon remains constant in any single location, but because it circulates through interconnected pathways that constrain extremes. In the short term, carbon moves rapidly between the atmosphere and living systems. Plants absorb carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, using energy from sunlight to build organic molecules. Animals consume plants or other animals, transferring that carbon through food webs. Respiration returns carbon dioxide to the air as energy is released. Microorganisms break down dead material, completing the cycle. These exchanges occur constantly, responding to changes in temperature, light, and resource availability. They allow ecosystems to adjust quickly to local conditions. At the same time, the oceans act as a vast intermediary. Carbon dioxide dissolves into surface waters, where it can remain in dissolved form or be taken up by marine organisms. Some of this carbon becomes part of shells or skeletal material, When these organisms die, their remains sink, transporting carbon into deeper waters. There, it may remain isolated from the atmosphere for centuries or longer. This slow transfer acts as a buffer, reducing rapid swings in atmospheric carbon levels. Geological processes extend the carbon cycle even further in time. Over long periods, carbon is locked into rocks through sedimentation and chemical reactions. Volcanic activity and weathering gradually return some of this carbon to the atmosphere. These processes operate over millions of years, providing a deep background regulation that links Earth's interior with its surface conditions. Although slow, they prevent carbon from accumulating indefinitely in any single reservoir. What makes the carbon cycle stabilizing is not its speed, but its structure. Multiple pathways connect reservoirs with different response times. Rapid biological exchange responds quickly to changing conditions. Oceanic processes introduce delay. Geological processes add long-term constraint. Together, these layers prevent abrupt changes from dominating planetary behavior. Short-term fluctuations are absorbed by slower components, while long-term trends are shaped by deep, persistent processes. Feedback plays a critical role here as well. Changes in temperature influence biological activity, which alters carbon uptake and release. Ocean temperatures affect how much carbon dioxide can dissolve in water. Chemical reactions in rocks respond to atmospheric conditions over long periods. Each response feeds back into the system, influencing future conditions. These feedbacks do not aim to preserve a particular climate state. They limit how far and how fast conditions can shift. It is important to understand that stability in the carbon cycle does not mean constancy. Atmospheric carbon levels have varied significantly throughout Earth's history. Ice ages, warm periods, and transitions between them reflect changes in how carbon is distributed. What persists is the system's capacity to reorganize carbon in ways that remain compatible with planetary function. Stability lies in continuity of regulation, not in fixed values. Life itself is deeply intertwined with this regulation. Biological activity both responds to and reshapes carbon availability. Over time, life has altered the atmosphere, oceans, and surface chemistry in profound ways. These changes did not break the system, they became part of it. The carbon cycle adjusted as new forms of life emerged, reinforcing the principle that stability evolves alongside change. From a short-term perspective, carbon movement may appear uneven or unpredictable. Local ecosystems experience variation. Seasonal cycles shift concentrations. Disturbances alter exchange rates. Yet when viewed across appropriate timescales, the pattern becomes clearer. Carbon continues to move, reservoirs continue to exchange, and extremes are constrained. The system remains coherent. The carbon cycle demonstrates how stability can depend on delay as much as on immediacy. Quick responses address immediate change. Slow responses provide memory and restraint. By linking fast biological processes with slow geological ones, the carbon cycle integrates present conditions with deep time. Through this integration, nature maintains a form of balance that is flexible, resilient, and enduring. In this way, the carbon cycle reinforces a central theme of this story. Stability is not achieved by stopping movement. It is achieved by organizing movement across time. By allowing carbon to circulate through multiple pathways at different speeds, the Earth system prevents short-term fluctuations from overwhelming long-term continuity. Through this quiet, persistent circulation, nature finds stability at one of its most fundamental levels. Water is another substance whose continuous movement plays a central role in maintaining stability across the planet. Like carbon, water does not remain fixed in one place. It circulates through the atmosphere, oceans, land, and living organisms in a repeating pattern known as the water cycle. This movement regulates temperature, redistributes energy, and supports life in nearly every environment. Stability arises not from storing water in one reservoir, but from keeping it in motion. The cycle begins at the surface, where energy from the sun drives evaporation. Liquid water absorbs heat and changes into vapor, carrying energy upward into the atmosphere. This process cools the surface, preventing excessive warming, As water vapor rises, it eventually cools and condenses into clouds. During condensation, stored energy is released back into the atmosphere, influencing air movement and weather patterns. In this way, the water cycle transfers energy from the surface into the atmosphere, shaping circulation on both local and global scales. Precipitation returns water to the surface in the form of rain, snow, or ice. This return is not uniform. Some regions receive abundant rainfall, while others remain dry. Yet even this uneven distribution contributes to stability. Water flowing across land shapes landscapes, transports nutrients, and replenishes ecosystems. Rivers move water from areas of excess to areas of scarcity. Over time, this movement prevents water from accumulating indefinitely in one place while leaving others depleted. Water also moderates temperature through its physical properties. Large bodies of water warm and cool more slowly than land. This slows seasonal temperature swings and stabilizes climates, especially near coastlines. In colder regions, snow and ice reflect sunlight, influencing how much energy is absorbed at the surface. When ice forms or melts, it absorbs or releases heat, further moderating temperature changes. These phase changes act as buffers, delaying rapid shifts and smoothing extremes. Within living systems, water is essential to stability at every level. It transports nutrients, removes waste, and provides the medium in which chemical reactions occur. Organisms regulate their internal water balance carefully, adjusting intake and loss to maintain function. At larger scales, vegetation influences how water moves through ecosystems. Plants draw water from soil and release it into the atmosphere through transpiration, affecting humidity, cloud formation, and local climate. Biological activity becomes part of the cycle, reinforcing regulation through feedback. The water cycle also interacts closely with other stabilizing systems. Temperature influences evaporation rates. Atmospheric circulation shapes precipitation patterns. Geological features guide water flow across land. Each interaction adds another layer of regulation. Changes in one part of the system influence others, preventing any single process from operating in isolation. Stability emerges from this interconnectedness. Time once again plays a critical role. Some water moves quickly, cycling through the atmosphere in days or weeks. Other water remains stored in glaciers, groundwater, or deep oceans for centuries or longer. These long-term reservoirs act as buffers, releasing water slowly and providing continuity during dry periods. The presence of both fast and slow pathways allows the system to respond to short-term variation while maintaining long-term balance. Disturbances affect the water cycle just as they do other systems. Droughts reduce surface water and stress ecosystems. Floods redistribute water and reshape landscapes. These events can be disruptive locally, but they do not usually undermine the cycle itself. The water cycle persists because it is driven by fundamental energy flows and physical properties. Even when patterns shift, movement continues. It is important to understand that stability in the water cycle does not mean predictability at every moment. Weather varies, seasons shift, long-term climate changes alter patterns of precipitation. Stability lies in the continuation of circulation rather than in fixed outcomes. Water continues to move, to change state, and to connect different parts of the system. Through its constant motion, water links surface and sky, land and sea, living systems and physical processes. It carries energy, shapes environments, and supports regulation across scales. By cycling endlessly rather than remaining still, water helps prevent extremes from dominating the planet. In this ongoing movement, the water cycle demonstrates once again how nature maintains stability, not by resisting change, but by organizing it into persistent, responsive flow. Beyond the cycles of water and carbon, Earth's deepest stabilizing forces operate on timescales far longer than human experience. Geological processes move slowly, often imperceptibly, yet they play a crucial role in maintaining planetary stability over millions of years. These processes reshape the surface, regulate long-term climate, and influence the conditions under which life persists. Their power lies not in speed, but in persistence. At the surface, weathering and erosion continuously break down rocks, wind, water, temperature changes, and chemical reactions wear mountains down grain by grain. Rivers carry this material toward the oceans, where it is deposited as sediment. Over time, layers accumulate, storing minerals and elements that once formed solid land. This slow redistribution of material influences nutrient availability, soil formation, and carbon storage. Stability emerges because these processes operate steadily, preventing extreme accumulation in any single place. Beneath the surface, plate tectonics adds another layer of regulation. Earth's outer shell is divided into moving plates that shift gradually over time. Where plates collide, mountains rise. Where they separate, new crust forms. These movements reshape continents, alter ocean basins, and influence atmospheric circulation by changing the distribution of land and sea. Though slow, these shifts have lasting effects on climate by redirecting winds, currents, and rainfall patterns. Volcanic activity connects Earth's interior to its surface. Volcanoes release gases and materials that influence atmospheric composition and soil fertility. Over long periods, volcanic emissions contribute carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, counterbalancing the gradual removal of carbon through weathering and sedimentation. This exchange forms part of a long-term feedback that helps regulate global temperatures. When carbon levels fall too low, volcanic release becomes relatively more significant. When levels rise, weathering accelerates, drawing carbon back into rocks. This feedback does not maintain a fixed climate, but it constrains extremes over geological time. These processes operate far too slowly to address short-term disturbances. They do not prevent storms, droughts, or rapid climate shifts. Instead, they provide a deep background stability that shapes the long-term trajectory of the planet. By acting over millions of years, geological processes ensure that no single state persists indefinitely. Continents drift, climates shift, and ecosystems reorganize. Yet the planet remains habitable across vast spans of time. Time itself becomes a stabilizing factor at this scale. Slow processes smooth out abrupt changes by integrating them into longer trends. A brief period of warming or cooling becomes less significant when averaged across thousands of years. Geological regulation does not eliminate variation. It absorbs it into a broader pattern, allowing continuity to emerge from change. It is important to recognize that geological stability does not imply gentleness. Earth's history includes massive eruptions, continental collisions, and periods of intense transformation. These events can be disruptive in the short term, yet they are part of a larger system that redistributes energy and material rather than allowing permanent imbalance. Stability, here, is not calmness, it is endurance. The interaction between geological processes and life further reinforces this stability. As life alters surface chemistry and erosion patterns, it influences how rocks, weather, and sediments form. In turn, geological changes shape the environments in which life evolves. This reciprocal influence links deep Earth processes with biological regulation, extending stability across scales. When viewed from a human perspective, geological change can feel distant or irrelevant, but without these slow processes, the planet would gradually drift into states that no longer support liquid water or life. Mountains would not renew nutrients. Carbon would not be recycled effectively. Climate extremes would accumulate without long-term correction. Geological processes remind us that stability does not require speed. Some of nature's most important regulatory mechanisms operate so slowly that they escape immediate notice. Yet their cumulative effect is profound. By reshaping the planet gradually and persistently, they provide a deep foundation upon which faster systems operate. Through erosion, tectonics, and volcanic exchange, Earth maintains a long-term balance that supports continuity rather than permanence. The planet does not hold itself still. It changes steadily, redistributing material and energy across immense spans of time. In this slow, relentless motion, geology contributes quietly but decisively to how nature finds stability. Stability does not mean that a system never moves away from balance. In nature, periods of imbalance are not only common, they are expected. Droughts, cooling phases, warming periods, population declines, and ecological shifts all represent moments when systems are pushed away from familiar conditions. These deviations are not automatically signs of failure. In many cases, they are essential parts of how stability is tested, reshaped, and maintained over time. Natural systems are built to tolerate a certain amount of variation. Temperature, moisture, nutrient availability, and population size all fluctuate within ranges that organisms and ecosystems can absorb. When conditions move within these ranges, regulatory processes adjust gradually. Growth slows or accelerates, energy use shifts, interactions between species change. These responses often restore familiar patterns, but they do so without returning conditions to an exact previous state. Stability, here, is flexible rather than rigid. Imbalance becomes more noticeable when conditions push systems toward the edges of what they can tolerate. A prolonged drought may reduce plant growth and alter species composition. A cooling period may shift the boundaries of habitats. A sudden loss of a key species may disrupt food webs. In these moments, systems reorganize. Some components decline, others expand, and new relationships emerge. This reorganization can look like instability when observed in isolation, but it is often part of a broader adaptive response. It is important to distinguish between fluctuation and breakdown. Fluctuation involves movement within a system's capacity to respond. Breakdown occurs when regulatory mechanisms can no longer operate effectively. Many natural imbalances fall into the first category. They challenge systems without overwhelming them. In doing so, they activate feedback, encourage diversification, and test the limits of resilience. Systems that never experience stress may appear stable, but they can become brittle over time. Those that experience manageable stress often remain more adaptable. Imbalance also plays a role in shaping long-term patterns. Periods of environmental change drive adaptation, succession, and diversification. Species adjust their behavior, timing, or distribution. Ecosystems reorganize their structure. Over generations, these responses influence evolutionary trajectories. Stability at large scales depends on this capacity to absorb disturbance and integrate its effects, rather than resisting all change. At the planetary level, imbalance is equally significant. Climate has never been fixed. Ice ages, warm periods, and transitional phases have all occurred as part of Earth's history. These shifts altered sea levels, atmospheric composition, and the distribution of life. Yet the planet did not lose coherence. Instead, regulatory processes operated across different timescales, shaping how far and how fast conditions could move. Stability emerged not as constancy, but as continuity through variation. Human perception often struggles with this idea. From a short-term viewpoint, imbalance feels threatening because it disrupts expectations. Crops fail, landscapes change, and familiar patterns break down. From a longer perspective, however, these shifts are part of a dynamic system exploring new configurations. Stability is not the preservation of the present. It is the maintenance of function across changing conditions. This does not mean that all imbalances are harmless. When disturbances are too intense, too frequent, or too widespread, systems may cross thresholds beyond which recovery becomes difficult. The difference lies in scale and duration. Manageable imbalance activates regulation. Excessive imbalance can overwhelm it. Understanding this distinction is crucial for interpreting change without assuming collapse at every deviation. Imbalance also reveals where regulatory processes are strongest and where they are weakest. Responses to stress highlight feedback pathways, constraints, and dependencies that may remain hidden during calm periods. In this way, disturbance becomes informative. It shows how stability is constructed rather than simply assumed. Seen through this lens, imbalance is not the opposite of stability. It is one of its ingredients. By pushing systems away from equilibrium, imbalance forces response, adjustment, and learning at both ecological and evolutionary levels. Stability persists not because systems avoid disruption, but because they are shaped by it. As this story continues, this understanding becomes increasingly important. Stability in nature is not a fragile condition maintained by constant protection. It is a dynamic state sustained through challenge, response, and reorganization. Imbalance is not a warning sign by default. It is a signal that regulation is at work, guiding systems as they move through change rather than breaking under it. As natural systems move through periods of imbalance, there are moments when gradual change leads to sudden shifts. These moments are often described as thresholds or tipping points. A threshold marks a boundary beyond which a system begins to behave differently. Understanding these boundaries is essential for understanding stability, because they reveal both the strength and the limits of regulation. For long periods, a system may absorb change without obvious transformation. Feedback mechanisms operate quietly, counteracting deviation and maintaining familiar patterns. Temperature fluctuates, populations rise and fall, and ecosystems reorganize slightly, yet overall structure appears stable. This apparent steadiness can persist even as underlying conditions slowly shift. Pressure accumulates not as visible disruption, but as strain within regulatory processes. A tipping point occurs when that strain exceeds the system's capacity to compensate. Beyond this point, feedback that once stabilized the system may weaken or reverse. Responses that previously restored balance become insufficient. Small additional changes can then produce disproportionately large effects. The system moves rapidly toward a new state, not because it suddenly became fragile, but because its regulatory structure has changed. It is important to understand that tipping points are not random. They arise from the internal organization of systems. Constraints, delays, and feedback pathways define how much variation a system can absorb. When those limits are reached, behavior changes. This does not imply failure in a moral or functional sense. It reflects a shift in what configuration is viable under the new conditions. In ecosystems, thresholds can appear when key species decline beyond recoverable levels, when habitat connectivity is lost, or when resource availability changes persistently. In such cases, the system may reorganize around different interactions. New species may dominate. Energy and nutrient flows may follow different pathways. The resulting system can still be stable, but it is stable in a different form. At larger scales, thresholds also shape planetary behavior. Changes in temperature, ice coverage, or ocean circulation can alter feedback patterns. For example, reflective surfaces may decrease, allowing more energy absorption. Circulation patterns may weaken, slowing energy redistribution. These changes can accelerate transitions without requiring dramatic external forcing. The shift occurs because internal dynamics have crossed a boundary. Thresholds are often difficult to detect in advance. Because systems can appear stable up to the point of transition, change may seem sudden or unexpected. In reality, the conditions for transition have been developing gradually. The challenge lies in recognizing slow trends beneath short-term variability. Stability can mask vulnerability when viewed only over brief intervals. It is also important to avoid alarmism when discussing tipping points. Not every threshold leads to collapse. Many lead to reorganization rather than loss of function. Systems may settle into new stable states that persist for long periods. From a broader perspective, these transitions are part of how nature explores different configurations over time. Stability does not require remaining in one state forever. What thresholds reveal most clearly is that stability has structure. It is not an unlimited capacity to absorb change. It operates within bounds, defined by feedback, energy flow, and material constraints. When those bounds are exceeded, stability does not vanish. It transforms. Understanding thresholds shifts the focus from preventing all change to managing the pace and scale of change. Systems are more likely to remain coherent when transitions occur slowly enough for regulation and adaptation to operate. Abrupt, overwhelming pressures leave fewer options for adjustment. In this way, thresholds highlight a deeper principle. Stability in nature is not about maintaining a particular arrangement. It is about maintaining the ability to reorganize without losing continuity. Tipping points mark moments when reorganization becomes unavoidable. They are not signs that regulation has failed, but indicators that regulation has reached its limits under existing conditions. By recognizing thresholds as part of natural dynamics, it becomes easier to see stability as a process rather than a destination. Systems move, pause, and sometimes shift direction entirely. Through these changes, continuity is preserved not by holding on to the past, but by forming new patterns that fit the present. As the story of stability unfolds, one influence stands out as relatively new within Earth's long regulatory history. Human activity has become a significant factor interacting with natural systems. This does not place humanity outside nature, nor does it make human influence unique in principle. It makes it notable in scale, speed, and reach. Humans have become a variable that interacts with existing feedback mechanisms, sometimes reinforcing them, sometimes pushing against them. For most of Earth's history, changes in climate, landscapes, and ecosystems were driven primarily by geological processes, orbital variation, and biological evolution. These forces operated over long timescales, allowing regulatory systems time to respond. Human activity introduces changes that often occur much more rapidly. Land use can shift within decades. Atmospheric composition can change within a few generations. Resource extraction can alter ecosystems faster than many natural feedbacks are able to adjust. This difference in pace is critical. Natural systems are structured around response times. Some feedbacks act quickly, while others require centuries or longer. When changes occur faster than slower feedbacks can respond, regulation becomes strained. This does not mean that stability disappears, but it does mean that systems may move toward thresholds more quickly than they otherwise would. Human influence, therefore, interacts with stability primarily by altering the timing of change. At the same time, humans remain embedded within the same constraints as all other organisms. Energy use, material availability, and physical laws still apply. Human societies depend on water cycles, climate regulation, soil formation, and biological productivity. When these systems are disrupted, consequences feed back into human systems as well. This mutual dependence means that human influence cannot escape natural regulation. It becomes part of it. Human activity also introduces new forms of feedback. Agriculture reshapes nutrient cycles. Urbanization alters local climate and water flow. Industrial processes change atmospheric composition. These changes influence temperature, precipitation, and ecosystem behavior, which then affect human activity in return. The system becomes more tightly coupled. Actions taken in one region can influence conditions far away, sometimes in unexpected ways. Stability now depends on a broader network of interactions that includes social, technological, and ecological components. It is important to avoid framing human influence as purely destructive or purely corrective. Nature has always incorporated new variables. Oxygen-producing organisms once transformed the atmosphere dramatically. The emergence of land plants reshaped erosion and carbon storage. These changes altered regulatory systems without ending them. The difference lies in rate and coordination. Biological changes unfolded over long spans. Human-driven changes often occur faster and with less built-in feedback. This does not mean that natural systems are powerless. Feedback still operates. Changes in climate influence agriculture. Resource depletion alters economic behavior. Environmental stress reshapes settlement patterns. These responses are part of the same regulatory logic seen throughout nature. Stability emerges when response follows pressure in a way that limits extremes. When response is delayed or fragmented, imbalance grows. Understanding humans as a variable within natural systems shifts the focus away from control and toward interaction. Stability cannot be imposed unilaterally. It emerges from alignment between human activity and the constraints of the systems that support it. Actions that push against fundamental limits increase strain. Actions that work within those limits tend to be absorbed more effectively. This perspective also reframes responsibility. Humans do not stand apart from nature, capable of breaking it without consequence. They participate in feedback loops that respond regardless of intention. Stability at this stage of Earth's history depends on how human systems interact with ecological and planetary regulation, not on whether change occurs at all. By recognizing humanity as part of the system rather than an external force, it becomes possible to understand current challenges without assuming inevitable collapse or effortless control. Stability remains a process, shaped by interaction, timing, and constraint. Human influence does not end that process. It becomes one of the factors through which stability is tested, reshaped, and potentially maintained under new conditions. When natural systems are exposed to sustained pressure, whether from environmental shifts or human activity, stability does not usually return by restoring previous conditions exactly. Instead, systems adjust by forming new patterns that fit the circumstances they now face. This process of adjustment is not immediate and rarely smooth. It unfolds through feedback, constraint, and gradual reorganization, revealing how stability adapts rather than simply resists change. Adjustment begins when existing regulatory mechanisms are stretched. Resources become scarcer, temperatures shift, or interactions between species change in persistent ways. At first, familiar responses attempt to compensate. Growth slows, behavior shifts, and energy use is altered. If pressure continues, deeper changes follow. Species distributions may shift, ecosystems may reorganize their structure. Some components decline while others become more prominent. Stability is not lost in this process, it is redirected. A key feature of adjustment under pressure is selectivity. Not all parts of a system respond in the same way. Some are more flexible, others more vulnerable. Those that can function under the new conditions tend to persist and shape the emerging configuration. This selective process operates without intention. It reflects compatibility rather than preference. Over time, the system settles into a pattern that can be maintained under the prevailing constraints. Feedback plays a central role in guiding this transition. As components respond to pressure, their actions alter conditions for others. These changes feed back into the system, reinforcing some pathways and weakening others. Responses that reduce strain tend to persist. Responses that increase strain tend to fade. This filtering process does not guarantee optimal outcomes, but it does limit extremes. Stability emerges as a byproduct of what can continue functioning. It is important to recognize that adjustment often involves loss as well as gain. Some species, structures, or relationships may not persist. Their disappearance can be disruptive in the short term, altering energy flows and interactions. Yet this loss also frees resources and space, allowing other components to expand or new ones to emerge. Stability does not require preserving every element. It requires maintaining overall coherence and function. Adjustment also depends strongly on timescale. Rapid pressures leave little room for response, increasing the likelihood of abrupt transitions. Slower pressures allow regulatory mechanisms to operate more effectively. Populations have time to adapt. Ecosystems reorganize gradually. Feedback can guide change rather than being overwhelmed by it. Stability is more likely to persist when adjustment occurs within the response capacity of the system. Human systems are subject to the same logic. Economic, technological, and social structures respond to environmental and resource constraints through adaptation. Some practices become unsustainable and fade. Others are reinforced. Stability in human systems, like stability in natural systems, depends on alignment with underlying limits rather than on resistance to them. Seen from a distance, adjustment under pressure can appear uncertain or unstable. Familiar patterns dissolve, and new ones are not yet fully formed. From a longer perspective, however, this period represents transition rather than breakdown. Systems are exploring new configurations, guided by feedback and constraint, toward forms that can persist. This understanding reshapes how pressure itself is viewed. Pressure is not simply a threat to stability. It is a driver of reorganization. When pressures remain within the capacity of systems to respond, they stimulate adaptation and renewal. Stability is maintained not by avoiding all stress, but by remaining responsive to it. As this story continues, this idea becomes increasingly important. Stability in nature is not the maintenance of a fixed state. It is the ability to find workable patterns under changing conditions. Adjustment under pressure reveals how deeply this capacity is embedded in natural systems. Through continuous response, selection, and reorganization, nature finds new forms of stability even as old ones fade. Stability in nature cannot be understood without considering time. The pace at which processes unfold shapes how systems respond to change and how stability appears when observed. Some adjustments happen almost instantly, while others require years, centuries, or far longer. These different speeds do not compete with one another, they work together, forming layered regulation that allows systems to remain coherent across changing conditions. Fast processes address immediate variation. In living organisms, heart rate, breathing, and hormone release adjust within moments. In ecosystems, populations respond quickly to changes in food availability or predation. In the atmosphere, winds shift and clouds form within hours. These rapid responses prevent small disturbances from escalating. They act as the first line of regulation, smoothing short-term fluctuations before they grow large enough to threaten stability. Slow processes provide depth and memory. Forests take decades to mature. Soils form over centuries. Ocean circulation patterns unfold over years or longer. Geological processes operate across millions of years. These slower dynamics do not react to every small change. Instead, they integrate many short-term variations into longer trends. This integration prevents systems from being driven entirely by momentary extremes. Stability emerges from the accumulation of many small adjustments rather than from constant correction. Problems arise when the pace of change exceeds the response time of key stabilizing processes. If pressure builds faster than feedback can act, systems may move toward thresholds more quickly than expected. Rapid shifts can overwhelm regulation, not because regulation is weak, but because it was designed for a different tempo. Understanding stability, therefore, requires attention not only to magnitude, but to speed. Different components of a system often respond on different timescales. This diversity of response speeds increases resilience. When fast processes reach their limits, slower ones may still provide restraint. When slow processes lag, fast ones may buffer immediate impacts. Together, they create a layered defense against disruption. Stability becomes a property of the system as a whole, rather than of any single process. This layered timing also explains why systems can appear unstable when viewed too narrowly. Short-term observation captures fluctuation without context. A population may seem to be declining rapidly, a climate pattern may appear erratic, or a landscape may look degraded. When viewed across appropriate timescales, however, these changes often fit into longer patterns of adjustment and recovery. Stability becomes visible only when observation matches the scale of regulation. Human perception is often biased toward short timescales. Daily and yearly changes feel urgent, while slower trends fade into the background. This can distort judgment, making normal variations seem alarming or masking gradual shifts until they become pronounced. Recognizing the role of time helps align perception with process. It allows stability to be understood as a moving pattern rather than a fixed condition. Nature does not operate on a single clock. It uses many. Fast reactions manage immediate needs. Slow processes guide long-term direction. Stability arises from their interaction. When these layers remain aligned, systems persist even in the face of ongoing change. By appreciating how different speeds of response contribute to regulation, it becomes easier to see why nature endures. Stability is not the absence of movement, it is the coordination of movement across time. Through this coordination, systems absorb variation, respond to pressure, and maintain continuity without ever needing to stand still. A common misunderstanding about stability is the idea that it represents a final state of balance, a point at which opposing forces cancel out and nothing more needs to change. In nature, such a state almost never exists. Perfect equilibrium would mean no gradients of energy, no differences in temperature or pressure, and no movement of matter. Under those conditions, life could not function, weather would cease, and geological processes would stall. Stability, therefore, depends on the absence of perfect balance rather than its achievement. Energy gradients are essential. Warm regions must exist alongside cooler ones for air and water to move. Chemical differences must persist for reactions to occur. Nutrients must be unevenly distributed for organisms to seek, consume, and recycle them. These imbalances create flow. Flow supports interaction. Interaction allows regulation. Stability emerges from maintaining these gradients within limits, not from erasing them. Living systems illustrate this clearly. Cells maintain different concentrations of ions inside and outside their membranes. This imbalance allows electrical signaling and energy production. If concentrations equalized completely, essential processes would stop. At larger scales, ecosystems depend on differences in resource availability. Some areas are more productive than others. Some seasons are richer than others. Organisms respond to these differences through movement, growth, and reproduction. Uniformity would remove the signals that guide regulation. At the planetary scale, imbalance drives circulation. Differences in solar heating between equator and poles power atmospheric and oceanic currents. Variations in surface reflectivity influence how energy is absorbed and released. These imbalances never disappear entirely. They are continually reshaped by feedback, but they persist because they are necessary. Stability is maintained by preventing extremes, not by eliminating contrast. This perspective helps explain why nature often appears restless. Weather patterns shift, populations fluctuate, and landscapes evolve. These movements are not signs that stability has failed. They are signs that regulation is active. Systems are constantly adjusting to maintain workable differences. Stillness would signal the absence of regulation rather than its success. Attempts to force perfect balance tend to backfire. Systems that are overly constrained lose flexibility. When variation finally breaks through, responses can be abrupt and difficult to manage. Natural stability relies on allowing limited imbalance so that adjustment remains continuous rather than episodic. Small corrections are easier to absorb than large, sudden ones. It is also important to recognize that acceptable imbalance changes over time. What counts as a functional range under one set of conditions may shift as environments evolve. Stability adapts by redefining its boundaries. The system does not cling to a single configuration. It maintains coherence by reshaping how imbalance is distributed and managed. Understanding that perfect balance never exists removes the expectation that stability should look calm or static. Instead, it highlights the importance of motion, difference, and flow. Nature does not seek to eliminate tension between opposing forces. It organizes that tension so that it remains productive rather than destructive. In this sense, stability is dynamic restraint rather than stillness. It is the art of keeping systems active without letting activity spiral out of control. By preserving gradients and allowing movement, nature sustains the processes that make regulation possible. Perfect balance would bring those processes to a halt. Controlled imbalance keeps them alive. Seen this way, the absence of equilibrium is not a problem to be solved. It is a requirement for persistence. Stability arises not from flattening the world into sameness, but from maintaining structured difference over time. Through this continuous, managed imbalance, nature remains active, responsive, and enduring. One of the most important insights that emerges from studying stability in nature is that it is not something that can be designed or imposed from above. Stability is an emergent property. It arises from countless local interactions taking place simultaneously, without central direction or overarching control. No single process determines the outcome. Instead, stability forms as a collective result of how parts of a system respond to one another over time. Emergence becomes visible when looking across scales. Individual organisms follow simple rules shaped by biology and environment. They seek energy, avoid harm, reproduce when conditions allow, and respond to immediate feedback. None of these behaviors is intended to stabilize an ecosystem. Yet when millions of such interactions occur together, population patterns form, energy flows, organize, and ecosystems persist. Stability appears not because it was planned, but because interaction produces constraint. The same principle applies beyond biology. In physical systems, molecules follow basic laws of motion and chemistry. They collide, bond, separate, and exchange energy. From these interactions emerge temperature, pressure, and phase changes. No molecule regulates climate or controls weather, yet atmospheric circulation develops from local differences in heating and density. Global patterns arise from local cause and effect, repeated at enormous scale. Stability is not commanded. It is assembled. Emergent stability depends heavily on feedback. Local actions influence conditions, which then influence future actions. When these feedback loops are widespread and interconnected, they create structure. Some interactions reinforce one another, others counterbalance excess. Over time, patterns that remain compatible with the system's constraints persist, while those that are not fade away. Stability is the residue of what continues to work. Importantly, emergence means that stability cannot be reduced to any single component. Removing or altering one part may change the system's behavior, but it does not eliminate the process by which stability forms. New interactions take its place. The system reorganizes. This is why natural systems are often resilient even when components are lost. Stability resides in relationships rather than in parts. Emergent stability also explains why control is limited. Because no single element governs the whole, attempts to manage systems through isolated interventions often have unintended consequences. Changing one interaction alters others. Effects propagate in ways that are difficult to predict precisely. Nature does not respond linearly. It responds relationally. Stability emerges from balance across many pathways, not from optimization along one. This does not mean that systems are chaotic or directionless. Constraints still apply. Energy availability, physical laws, and material limits shape what patterns can form. Emergence operates within boundaries. Stability is the pattern that fits those boundaries most consistently over time. It is not random, but it is not designed either. Understanding stability as emergent reframes how coherence is perceived. Order does not require oversight. It requires interaction under constraint. When components respond to feedback and remain connected, structure appears naturally. This structure can shift, adapt, and reorganize while remaining recognizable. Stability persists, even as form changes. At every level of nature, from cells to ecosystems to the planet itself, this principle holds. No master system holds everything in place. Instead, countless small adjustments combine to produce continuity. Stability is not a feature added to nature. It is what emerges when nature is allowed to interact with itself over time. Through emergence, nature demonstrates that persistence does not depend on rigidity or control. It depends on connection. When interactions remain active and feedback remains functional, systems organize themselves into patterns that endure. In this self-organizing process, nature finds stability not by design, but by interaction. When all of these processes are viewed together, stability in nature begins to resemble a network rather than a balance point. It is a web of interacting mechanisms operating across scales, each influencing the others without central coordination. Local adjustments ripple outward. Global conditions feed back into local responses. Stability emerges from this constant exchange, distributed rather than concentrated, relational rather than fixed. At the smallest scales, cells regulate their internal chemistry, repairing damage and managing energy. These cellular processes support tissues and organs, which in turn shape the behavior of whole organisms. Organisms interact with one another, forming populations and communities. Those communities influence landscapes, nutrient cycles, and atmospheric composition. At the largest scale, planetary systems redistribute energy and matter, shaping the conditions under which life can exist. None of these layers operates in isolation. Each one both depends on and modifies the others. This interconnection means that stability does not reside in any single place. It cannot be located in one species, one feedback loop, or one environmental condition. Instead, it exists in the relationships between components. When those relationships remain responsive and connected, systems persist even as individual parts change. When connections weaken or fragment, stability becomes harder to maintain, not because change has occurred, but because regulation can no longer propagate effectively. A networked view of stability also explains why local disturbances do not necessarily lead to global collapse. A forest fire may devastate one area while leaving surrounding regions intact. Those intact regions then provide seeds, organisms, and energy flows that support recovery. Similarly, fluctuations in one part of the climate system may be buffered by slower responses elsewhere. Stability is distributed across space as well as time, reducing vulnerability to isolated shocks. This network structure also allows adaptation to spread. When conditions change, responses in one region can influence others. Species migrate, technologies and practices shift, energy flows reorganize. Over time, these adjustments propagate through the network, reshaping how stability is expressed without dismantling it entirely. Continuity is preserved not by freezing connections, but by allowing them to evolve. Importantly, networks can reorganize without losing coherence. Connections are added, weakened, or redirected. Some pathways become less important, others gain influence. Stability persists as long as the network retains enough connectivity for feedback to circulate. This flexibility is what allows systems to endure under changing conditions rather than shattering when stressed. Seeing stability as a network also clarifies why simple solutions often fail. Adjusting one element without considering its connections can disrupt feedback elsewhere. Because effects travel through relationships, interventions that ignore network structure can produce unintended outcomes. Nature maintains stability not through isolated corrections, but through coordinated interaction across many pathways. At a deeper level, this networked stability reflects a fundamental property of complex systems. Order does not require uniformity, it requires communication. When parts of a system remain linked through feedback, information about change can travel, responses can be coordinated without central control, stability becomes a shared property rather than an imposed one. As this story approaches its close, this image of nature as a network of balancing processes brings earlier themes together. Motion, feedback, limits, diversity, timing, and emergence all contribute to the same outcome. Stability is not a destination that systems reach and then hold. It is a pattern of relationships that remains viable over time. Through this network of interactions, nature maintains coherence while allowing variation, adaptation, and transformation. The world continues to move, to shift, and to reorganize, yet it does not dissolve into disorder. Stability persists because connection persists. In this continuous exchange between parts and whole, nature finds a way to endure. As this story comes to a close, it helps to step back and hold the full picture together. Stability in nature has appeared here, not as stillness, not as perfection, and not as control. It has appeared as continuity, a persistence that emerges from motion, interaction, and response. Across every scale we have explored, from cells to ecosystems to the planet itself, the same pattern repeats. Systems remain viable not because they resist change, but because they remain connected to it. Nature does not hold itself steady by freezing conditions in place. Instead, it allows variation to unfold within limits. Temperature shifts, populations fluctuate, landscapes transform, and cycles move endlessly through different states. Stability is maintained because feedback responds, constraints apply, and relationships adapt. What endures is not a single arrangement, but the ability to keep functioning as arrangements change. This understanding can be quietly reassuring. It suggests that stability is not something fragile that must be protected from all disturbance. It is something resilient, built from response rather than avoidance. Disturbance activates regulation. Change invites adjustment. Even loss, when it occurs within the capacity of a system to reorganize, becomes part of a longer pattern of persistence. Time plays a gentle but decisive role in this process. Fast changes are absorbed by slow ones. Short-term fluctuations are balanced by long-term trends. Memory is stored not in intention, but in structure. Oceans remember heat. Rocks remember carbon. Ecosystems remember disturbance through soil, seeds, and relationships. Stability is carried forward through these memories, linking past conditions to future possibilities. It is also worth noticing how little of this process requires direction. No single force governs the whole. Order arises from interaction under constraint. When connections remain intact, regulation emerges naturally. When those connections weaken, stability becomes harder to sustain. The lesson is not about control, but about coherence. Systems endure when relationships remain responsive and aligned with underlying limits. For someone listening quietly, this perspective can offer a different way of thinking about balance. Balance does not mean holding everything still. It means allowing movement without letting it become overwhelming. It means adjusting rather than resisting. In this sense, stability is not something achieved once and defended forever. It is something that happens continuously, moment by moment, as systems respond to the world around them. Nature finds stability not by standing apart from change, but by remaining engaged with it. Through feedback, timing, diversity, and connection, it maintains continuity in a restless universe. The same principles that allow forests to recover, climates to regulate, and life to persist also invite a calmer way of observing the world. Change does not have to signal collapse. Often, it signals regulation at work. As you rest now, there is no need to hold on to every detail. The broader pattern is enough. Stability arises from connection. Continuity emerges from response. Motion and balance are not opposites, but partners. Nature does not pause to remain stable. It moves, adjusts, and endures. We from Sleepy Stories wish you a good night.